This is a radio broadcast addressed from the League of Nations on the global war effort against the Morgana threat, where we report the recent happenings amongst the major nations contributing to the defense of our united front. I am your speaker, Ammaraglio Maus, but you may refer to me as Commissar, or simply the Speaker, whichever you or your government prefers. It's a new year, everybody. I hope all you listeners out there were able to spend some time with friends and family celebrating the New Year's festivities, counting down the clock till midnight, drinking, dancing, or perhaps you even made some New Year's resolutions of your own. I know I sure did, though it's more of a New Year's hope, so to speak, as I'm not sure how much I can influence it on my own. And what that is, dear listener, if you're curious, is that I plan to make sure that the vessel I've been assigned to has its own bell awaken, however I can do that. For those who don't know, I'm currently the League Commissioner and/or Advisor assigned to the Regia Marina, and as such I've been given command of a vessel of my own. It's a small but humble moss boat, and while it's not like the destroyer I had from my last job, I'm still quite fond of it. But we're not here just to talk about me, now are we? We want to hear about the fight against the Morgana continuing across the globe. While 1940 has just arrived, it seems so far like much of the same is in store. The land wars in Europe and Asia continue on, and Morgana activity took another spike as more and more appear in sea zones across the globe. This time backed by many leaders who seem to be working together, but in some cases against one another. To start the New Year's news and to mark the arrival of 1940, we start with the League itself, in which we here at the League of Nations wish to issue a statement to everyone listening. Now, this statement could be described as clear-eyed or even grim. However, we here at the League think it's best to be real about our situation and to temper implausible expectations. While the human world was grappling with needless and avoidable wars, a vast and undying alien enemy was prowling the waves, bending the weather to their will and possibly even triggering volcanic activity. From Rotterdam to Tokyo Bay all the way to Athens, they had attacked and murdered indiscriminately, and they are only getting more audacious with every passing day. The great naval powers of the world had chosen to make the International Naval Protection Force their weapon and humanity's shield. It is essential, absolutely essential, that this choice and this agreement be the basis of a just and lasting alliance, or all will be lost. Victory is not certain in 1940, and indeed, it's looking to merely be the beginning of the true war. A war which will require iron hearts, unfathomable courage, and sacrifice if we are to see it won. Following that rather bleak but real message from the League comes news from the Axis. This week, Germany chose to follow up on its deal with the Soviets from late 1939 through the war-planned Raid Base Arctic, which found 61% support, in order to have raiders based out of Zapanya-Lista Bay. The newly rebased raiders would be able to reach the approaches and the North Sea with much more freedom than those transiting out of the Baltic. Germany would now not only be able to threaten the Morgana positions in the regions, but also hinder the Allies' economic strength more effectively overall. After that comes news from the Allies. In the Salida Sea, British and Australian authorities came to the agreement with the powers that be in the Dutch East Indies following their latest war plan, Salida Sea Command Co-Equal, stating that they would be full partners in regional defense. Admiral Sir Percy Noble is the highest-ranking officer in the theater and assumed command of the BDA navies, with Vice Admiral Gerhard Wilhelm Stover as his second-in-command. Reports state that Singapore will be the new headquarters of this newly formed fleet. Following that comes news from Italy, who is starting the new year with the same vigor they had at the start of the war, maintaining their place as the leading nation in combating the Morgana threat. This week, the Italian people received quite the surprise. At the stroke of midnight on New Year's Day, Vanity broke into Italian radio transmissions with a speech that was grandiloquent even for her, with statements equally derisive and contemptuous. Now, while we've received some requests from the Italian Senate not to spread the message, we here at the League feel that, for full transparency, it should be heard. The speech itself was rather long, so we'll be paraphrasing it here on air. She began her speech stating, quote, "Rome had failed. The ancient empire was a corpse being propped up by a fat old fool who imagined himself to be a Kaiser when he was just a latter-day Tarquin the Proud. No, there would be a new Rome, a new empire, but it would be in service to the glorious Empress, a goddess on earth, an immortal spirit of beauty and grace. And I am calling the greatest of the Morgana to the Mediterranean to see this rightful ambition brought into reality. There will be a conference, one 1,000 times more grand than humanity's anxious little show at Zurich, and we, the Morgana, would determine how my empire would be apportioned and governed. And Rome would do nothing, because Rome could do nothing. It was obsolete, it was already dead, and the Regia Marina was only still twitching because it was at the extremities of the corpse. Mussolini, she then added, would be allowed to survive if he presented himself to her in a jester's costume when the time was right. It was a better deal than he would get from the rest of the world, end quote. Unsurprisingly, the Italians took all this rather personally, and an unusual number of volunteers rushed to the ports to support the fight to come. Ironically, the trade in looted contraband from Vanity's palace also seemed to be on the rise in the aftermath, as though people sought to understand her through her works. In other news, the Regia Marina was quite busy this week and will likely be for the following weeks as they begin to tackle the new Morgana drawn to the Mediterranean. Following the war plan Asian Sabotage, which found 89% support, the Regia Marina was sent to the Asian to investigate the doings of a prominent, if elusive, sabotage. Her interests seemed to be near the Turkish Straits, but in light of Vanity's pronouncement, nobody wanted to risk Morgana making a play for the version of her corpse that still loomed in the heart of Athens. Unfortunately, Sabotage found the Regia Marina before the Regia Marina found her. As the Italians passed Aegeos of Stratios from the west, she circled the island from the east and came upon them from the south. Aryan Fulceri was destroyed in the first minutes of combat, destroyed by explosions in her own ammunition stores. Iron Gricale nearly suffered the same fate, but her crew managed to contain the worst of the fires in time. There are some confusing accounts that the fires in Iron Gricale were not entirely started by shell hits from Morgana. Instead, they were also caused by pre-planted devices of unknown origin. This was a troubling event, if true. Sabotage's group lost a pair of cowardices that broke formation and tried to run, as they tend to do, but she and most of her force successfully withdrew from the engagement as the sun set, and the Italians chose not to pursue. Subsequent investigations suggested that the Regia Marina interrupted a meeting of some sort between Sabotage and passengers on a Turkish yacht. The human participants are as yet unknown. Following that comes news from France, the second leading member combating the Morgana threat. This week, pressured by the threat of German weather control in the north, Morgana human experimentation in the south, invisible fleets off the East African coast, and ongoing stream of terrifying hints from PC Bruno, the Latier's government took a big step this week. After some deliberation, the proposal for war plan Helgoland approach forced the minefield, passed with a 77% majority. Subsequently, the Marine Nationale was directed to enter the German-declared mine area in the North Sea, and in the expectation of a major RAF air raid on New Year's Day, accomplished the destruction of the German facility at Helgoland Island. If the Nazis were really in possession of Morgana weather-altering technology, it couldn't be assumed that British bombers could do their job alone. Indeed, it couldn't be assumed that the weather would ever allow British bombers to attack at all. Moreover, as early as the 29th, it became clear that the Kriegsmarine was cleaning house and planning to move some of its Baltic fleet westwards. There would be literally no better time to attack than now. So, at 11:24 on New Year's Eve, the combined fleet steamed from Cherbourg. Their experience with minesweeping was invaluable, and they were more hardened force overall than they had been just a few months ago. The British claimed to have accurate maps of the German minefields, obtained at some cost in submarines, sources say, but on the advice of PC Bruno, this information was discounted. It seemed at first they were lucky in their timing. The proposed route to Helgoland was full of mines, but the fleet was able to pass through without being sighted. The Morgana mistrust that had been lurking in the area for weeks was relatively easily driven away, and the Kriegsmarine flotilla that had been guarding the Helgoland bight rapidly retreated in some disarray. Some French officers even suspected that some Germans were engaging in a passive mutiny against the Helgoland program. Unfortunately for the French, at 8:02 on New Year's Day, the Helgoland facility proved that it could protect itself. Sensors across the continent detected an earthquake. French sailors felt their ears pop, and then pulses of an unknown force began emanating from the island itself, along with extraordinary meteorological activity. Brutal winds rose and reversed like cuts of a saw blade, and the sea simply went mad. The anchors holding mines placed around Helgoland were ripped from the seabed and sent skittering toward the combined fleet in chaotic abandon. MN Mogador was torn open and sunk in less than 10 minutes, struck by at least 3 mines. In her death throes, she crashed into MN Panther, who was broken in half and lost with all hands. 5 other ships were damaged as well. MN Strasbourg was hit the hardest with a boiler open to the sea. The fleet was on the verge of signaling a retreat when the winds and seas suddenly calmed and the island of Helgoland showed itself. The remainder of the fleet steamed and flanked a bombardment of the installation, but it had mortal defenders too. Shore emplacements were inaccurate, but the dreaded Stukas soon arrived in numbers. The French had British fighters covering the fleet, but the sheer numbers of the Germans sent ensured that the bombers got through. Heroic efforts by the pilots from the HMS Furious ensured that attacks on MN Georges Lager and MN Montcalm were disrupted, but they were not everywhere, and the Germans found MN Glory and sank her. The German air raid might have been worse, but the destroyer MN Orage seemed to have been strangely revitalized with the Helgoland facility's manipulations, and she called her own lightning out of the sky, driving off the 4th wave of the dive bomber wing. In the midst of the chaos, the British bombers arrived. Their bombs blanketed the facility, but some were spared for the French fleet as well, mistaking them for defending Germans. Fortunately, no French ships were damaged in the misidentification. Unfortunately, however, the facility itself, although struck several times, seemed unaffected. The fleet began their bombardment, and it was not long before the heavy guns began to have an effect. The strange noises from the island ceased, and the faint static charge that had lingered in the air over the North Sea for weeks was just suddenly gone. The combined fleet bombarded the ruins until they had just 10% of the ammunition left anyway, just to be sure. The withdrawal was fraught with difficulty, not least because many mines had become untethered and were now adrift. Furthermore, the arriving Baltic Fleet's destroyers shadowed them to the British-declared mine area, although the opportunity did not present itself for either side to attack. The Allies had won a major battle, and as a sudden, shocking cold settled over northern Europe in the days that followed, they realized that perhaps they had won more than that. Reports stated there continued to be aftershocks of the earthquake at Helgoland and flooding in Netherlands, however. Inspired by the victory, France hammered together a proposal for Britain, one that would pressure both German and Soviet interests in Romania, the Balkans, and the Caucasus, making it harder for both sides to get oil before the war in Finland got worse, and before Hitler turned his armies westward. Perhaps they could all be made to stumble before even getting out of the gate. It remained to be seen how Chamberlain would respond, of course. After that, we direct our attention over the Pacific with the Empire of Japan, who is the 3rd contributing nation to our united front. As the INPF's first captain left the Pacific, the relationship between the Imperial Japanese Navy and the Soviet Pacific Fleet was perhaps on the mend. Certainly, they had proven themselves able to cooperate under pressure, and the captain had forged personal ties from which more formal bonds might rise. The Soviets pushed to expand joint exercises quickly, and to share as much information as possible. But of course, the Japanese had been burned before, and if local officers could be trusted, well, the same might not be said for Stalin. The Imperial Japanese Navy accepted a liaison from the Red Fleet, though, and agreed that better coordination was desirable. If trust continued to be earned, then surely blessings would fall to all involved. In the South China Sea, Japan chose a creative method to address the ongoing crisis of Delusion's Maze, the labyrinth of Morgana mist and strange machines and electromagnetic oddities that was surely no less a shrine to its creator than the legendary Vanity Palace of Glass in the Mediterranean. When scout ships had failed and aircraft observations had proved fruitless, the Imperial Japanese Navy would now turn to a young Navy commander with unsurpassed mathematical insights. It was hoped that he would find the shape of the maze, and he would find the trick to navigating it, or to shutting it down altogether. He, along with a loyal, if occasionally frustrated, assistant, was delivered to the Paracel Islands by Casimir herself, and this was taken as a kind of sign. The bright new future for Japan would come from reason as much as brute force. Of course, for the mathematician who sailed into a place where the light bent strangely and where you sometimes misremember your mother's name or the color of your own eyes, the symbolism may have seemed a bit different. In other news, on New Year's Day, Japanese negotiations with the Chinese suffered a complication. A diplomat named Yao Zhongwu, formerly prominent among the nationalists, concluded that he could not be a party to the peace treaty under discussion. With the help of a crime lord, he fled Shanghai, reports say. It's possible that in his role as a translator for the Chinese delegation, he may also have taken copies of the treaty, which may portray the negotiation in a negative light. Worse, he is a well-known troublemaker who has repeatedly pushed for greater independence and powers for any new government in China. And in the south, the Chinese counterattack on Kunlun Pass has proven to be surprisingly effective. Despite their high losses, it is possible that they will retake the pass from Japanese forces. Following that, we head across the Pacific to hear news from the United States, who are the fourth contributing nation in the war against the Morgana. The first order of business this week for the U.S. Atlantic Fleet was tracking down the Morgana that escaped from the Battle of Martinique, who had potential weapons of mass destruction aboard. USS Sampson and USS Decatur steamed down the coastline in search of the missing Morgana, and Navy intelligence made friends with their colleagues in the Brazilian Navy to see if they could find any leads. A picture began to form, a single destruction spewing mist and carrying unnatural shapes on her deck, pushing south at relentless and terrible speed, but perhaps too badly damaged to sustain it for too much longer. Two averses close behind, whether as an escort or on the hunt, sin lingering far behind, shooing away the human ships who seemed too interested. And, of course, there was Venom. From the very start of the war, she had marked the Brazilian coastline as hers. As the American ships proceeded on their course, she made it very clear that they weren't welcome. No attacks, not yet, but hissing over the radio whenever storms rolled in or the night was at its most dead. But for all that, the Navy bypassed the Sin and caught up with destruction and her averses before they could even reach the River Plate. The fight that followed was easy, as things went. Destruction was already half dead, and she seemed to run out of ammunition within 10 minutes of the first engagement, while the averses were almost worse than useless, from a Morgana point of view at least, sending their swarms to try and steal the equipment on Destruction's deck before she was even sunk. They, in turn, were so distracted they barely defended themselves, so the U.S. had an easy win, and they collected what they came for from what was left of Destruction. Now it was just a matter of getting it back to Virginia. Meanwhile, in Honolulu, engineers were able to confirm what everyone already knew. USS Maryland had a chunk of Murder's hull embedded in a side after a desperate collision, and that chunk seemed to be digging deeper and deeper into Maryland's hull by the day. It was painful, but she allowed, as she thought she could learn from it. She thought she could see Murder's movements in a dream sometimes, and she begged for the chance to see if it was ultimately a weapon that could be used against the enemy, and naval authorities begrudgingly agreed, and proceeded with what is now known as the War Plan Careful Experimentation. Scientists and engineers from the Norfolk Project were flown in to fix her with monitors and with devices that would hopefully provide some protection against the worst effects from this little piece of murder. Of final note, unusual codes and chatter were being heard in the North Atlantic. They were suspiciously similar to some broadcasts attributed to sedition early in the war, sources say. Following that comes news from our comrades in the North, the Soviet Union, who are the fifth contributing member to our united front against the Morgana. Following their successes against the Finnish Koivisto fortress, the Soviets continued to blockade ports around Finland. As the Soviet Union mounted a blockade of the Finnish port of Vasa to prevent rumored Morgana technology exchanges, representatives of the Baltic Fleet gave League of Nations investigators full access to the Morganic machines already taken from Finnish vessels, as well as highly sanitized inventories of their own captured Morganic bits and bobs. The Finnish government protested that it couldn't be held responsible for technology taken out of context. There was no reason to believe that the Finnish captains and crews wouldn't have turned the stuff over to the League themselves if they had been given the chance. But there was no denying that it was a public relations win for the Soviet Union. In the Pacific Ocean, following some very effective joint operations with the Imperial Japanese Navy, coordinated by the first captain of the INPF, the Pacific Fleet hoped to repair some of the diplomatic damage done with Japan earlier in the war, and to increase coordination and information sharing dramatically. The Politburo also seemed to agree, as 78% were in support of the war plan New Cooperation Expansion, which was enacted later that day. The Japanese favored a more cautious approach to the same ends, but it was a start. Meanwhile, the German-Soviet Economic Conference was essentially a triumph from the Soviet perspective. Germany would get food, oil, and iron, while the Soviets would get German military technology, and most especially 3 heavy cruisers, KMS Blücher, KMS Prinz Eugen, and KMS Seydlitz. In a war where the fate of the human race rested with the nation's navies, well, one could hardly hope for better. The only real problem of the week for the Soviets was in the Far East, where reports of strange weather began to percolate through the Amur, and even stranger rumors of a Morgana sprouting legs and lurching away to the southwest were being received. Sources say army forces near the Chinese border were ill at ease. Following that, we head west to hear news from Germany, the 6th contributing nation to our war against the Morgana. On New Year's Day, as the French laid siege to Helgoland, the Kriegsmarine was transiting into the North Sea following the war plan Base of Operations, Western Outlook. The rebasing of forces from Kiel to Bremerhaven occurred late in the day on the 29th, and was therefore in the North Sea with only lighter forces. However, the Oberkommando der Marine ordered them to keep their distance in the early stages of the attack. It soon became apparent exactly why, as Helgoland saw to its own defense, at least at first. Sources say there were unnatural winds and terrible waves that turned the minefields into projectiles, and sights and sounds in the air so terrible that one might wish they were nightmares, the kind that burn away when you open your eyes in the morning. But of course, they weren't, and this was reality. But eventually, the island facility stopped. Perhaps it had run out of fuel. Perhaps the people who were operating it had run out of levers to pull. But regardless, now came the Stukas of the Sturz-Kampfgeschwader 1, along with their fighter escorts and fast ships to harry the French. The RAF and fighters from British carriers opposed the wing, but the number of German aircraft in their proximity to their bases proved decisive in the air. And although the Germans succeeded in sinking the French light cruiser Glory, and although relatively few planes were destroyed for the trade, despite freak lightning activity, their efforts weren't enough. The Helgoland facility was destroyed just before dusk on New Year's Day. There wasn't much left standing, and the French left the battlefield the clear victors. The Kriegsmarine hurried to the island in the aftermath of the Marine Nationale to offer whatever support was needed to the ruined garrison. But it turned out that there was no need. There was nothing left of them or the workers recently transported there. Kriegsmarine sailors arriving on the scene described bodies reduced to a coarse, waxy sand. Even more disturbingly, forensic investigation suggested that they had suffered this fate before the British bombers or the French guns had attacked the site, possibly during the earthquake that had rocked the island and disturbed the seas. Meanwhile, the situation in the Baltic was chaotic, if not particularly threatening. Even as the fleet moved out of Kiel, Kriegsmarine officers were escorting League investigators around the south of the sea and producing a reasonable amount of confiscated Morgana technology, enough to make it seem reasonably credible when they swore that Germany wasn't violating any provisions from Zurich in Helgoland. Of final note, German negotiators came to the German-Soviet Economic Conference prepared to eliminate major resource dependencies on anyone but the Soviets. In this, they were successful. The Soviets would get 3 heavy cruisers, KMS Blücher, KMS Prinz Eugen, and KMS Seydlitz, along with a technology transfer in exchange for food, iron, and oil. Soon, the Allied blockade of Germany would be at an effective end. Lastly, but certainly not least, comes news from the United Kingdom, the 7th contributing member to our united front against the Morgana. After shoring up defenses for the home isles, the Houses of Parliament were fairly unified on the decision for the next proposal to bolster Egypt's defenses, with said proposal finding 74% support in both houses. The proposal passed, and the war plan, Plan Egypt, was announced by the Prime Minister earlier in the week, with fortunate timing too. The Royal Navy planned to fortify its defenses in accordance with Plan Egypt and to devote considerably more effort to keeping the Suez Morgana free, and by the end of the week those plans became very urgent indeed, when Vanity took to the Italian airways announcing her New Year's promise to convene a special gathering of the Morgana in the Mediterranean. Alongside that, rumors that Despair's Abhorrent Sea broadcast could be heard in Malta were worrying, but ultimately not too decisive in the end. At the same time, defenses in the Pacific were being reorganized, the line separating the Morgana forces in the greater Pacific from those in the South China Sea and Indian Ocean would fall between the Spratly Islands and the Philippines. This was an open area of seas and freedom of movement. The warships of King George would ensure that the Morgana who spilled out from Delusion's maze would not threaten the South. Even as the line was being established, however, there came further reports that the Straits of Malacca were being threatened from the west. Nothing Fortress Singapore was not equal of, for the moment. Closer to home, Royal Navy forces, particularly the aircraft carriers in home waters, HMS Ark Royal, Furious, Courageous, Hermes, and even Old Argus and their fighters, played a role in the Battle of Helgoland Bight, the destruction of the weather-bending facility, and the restoration of a proper winter. HMS Furious's fighters were commended in particular by the French for driving off several attacks at the critical moment. The attack by the French fleet augmented the river of bombers that flowed over Helgoland like a tide. Wellingtons, Hamdens, Whitleys, and even hastily reconverted Harrows dropped hundreds of tons of bombs on the facility, with only a few mistaken drops on the French fleet, which at altitude was easily confused for German defenders. The raid was an unqualified success, with light losses to enemy anti-aircraft guns, but losses to German fighters were unacceptably high. Until the advent of heavier bombers capable of strong daylight defense, future raids would need to be completed at night. The French after-action reports also suggested that more bombers with heavier payloads would be required to deal with facilities of this type in the future. Unpleasantly, confirming that the Germans could manipulate the climate was almost a defeat in and of itself. The question now remained, how could the British make certain they possessed an equivalent capability? And with that concludes the League of Nations War Report for the first week of January of the new year. Our war against the invader has only begun, and we have yet a long road ahead of us. Only through cooperation of a united front can we truly defeat our foreign invaders. It won't be easy, and as the year continues, we can only hope for more cooperation amongst the nations. I also hope each and every one of you listening out there had a nice New Year's celebration. And if you want to start off your new year with a bang and show some extra support, consider purchasing some war bonds. War bonds are a great way to start off the new year. Not only do you show support for our fighting men and women across the globe, you also gain prestige to use and show off however you like. But with the new year rolling around, now's a great time to renew that League of Nations Commissioner membership card, or become a card-holding captain if you haven't already. With that card, you captains gain access to our exclusive network of traders to gain more resources, as well as the ability to rub shoulders with expert naval staff and diplomatic envoys who are more than eager to share their knowledge with aspiring and ambitious captains. And for you spreadsheet pushers out there, cardholders gain access to our specialized R&D and production centers to expedite all of your optimized, odd, and even wacky ideas. And don't forget to take advantage of our experienced harbor staff for faster refit and repair times. And for the cherry on top, every bell likes a card holder, and becoming one is a surefire way to help you get closer to any bell of your choice. They fly the League flag, so why shouldn't you? Thank you for listening, and may you have smooth seas.